In this section, we get to talk about anatomy and physiology and the role that digestion plays in keeping us alive. So we're going to actually be talking about the physical processes that are associated with digestion and where those occur. Of course, they occur in the digestive tract, which is also known as the GI tract or the alimentary canal. The main organs are going to be the stomach, which is actually just a temporary storage tank for food, the small intestines, which is the hotbed of activity when it comes to digestion itself, and the large intestines, which are there to produce, store, and then eliminate fecal matter. We do have some organs that play important roles in digestion. Those are considered accessory organs, and those are the ones that are listed there: the salivary glands, the pancreas, which is also an endocrine organ, the liver, and the gallbladder. When you talk about the GI tract, I want you to think about a garden hose, because in essence, that's what the GI tract is inside our body. It's going to have two openings, one at the mouth, one at the anus, and the hole in the middle, the part through which the food in its various forms travels, is known as the lumen. That is also where the material is mixed and churned and processed and broken down so it can be digested. The alimentary canal is basically a flexible muscular tube. Its job is to move food from your pie hole, from your mouth, down through the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, through the small intestine, through the large intestine, and then out to the big wide world through the anus. Digestion is the actual process of breaking foods down into small enough components that they can be used by the cell to produce either energy or to produce nutrients, which can be used to grow and repair tissues. That material is moved from intestinal cells, specifically cells in the walls of the small intestine, and then out into the circulatory system so the nutrients can be moved around the body, again, for production of energy, ATP, and the repair, maintenance, and growth of tissues. Absorption is the actual movement of those small, tiny molecules, those nutrients, from the GI tract into the intestinal cells. And from there, the material will either move into blood, into the circulatory system, or into the lymphatic system. And that's actually a pretty interesting aspect of the digestion of fats. This gives you a couple of images of what the GI tract looks like. If you are going into anatomy and physiology and you happen to be in 132, you'll be spending, via 132, A&P2, you'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about the specifics of the GI tract. Now, this is an important topic because there will be several ways through which we break down food. There's mechanical processing and there's digestion. When you talk about mechanical processing, that is taking big pieces or particles and breaking them down into smaller ones. That's chewing. Fancy name for chewing is mastication. No chemical bonds are broken in this process, and therefore no energy is released. So if you want to use a couple of examples, take a bite of an apple, you chew that into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of apple, and then you swallow that. Or if you heat with wood, you may take a log, take an axe, and break that log down into smaller pieces so you can have kindling. No chemical bonds are broken in those processes. You have mushed up apple that you swallow. You have kindling, which is still wood. When you talk about digestion, you are talking about breaking chemical bonds, and I oftentimes refer to it as chemical digestion to help you remember that you are actually breaking chemical bonds through digestion and releasing energy. This is the process where you take those large molecules, the macromolecules we're going to spend some time with, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, and you break them down into their building blocks. Proteins will be amino acids, carbohydrates will be glucose, fructose, or sucrose, and lipids will be generally triglycerides. This is where it all starts, the mouth. The mouth is going to be responsible for receiving food. You break it down into smaller particles through mechanical processing thanks to chewing, and you will also add saliva. So the saliva is going to be important because it will add moisture to the food that you have just swallowed, which is now known as a bolus, which helps lubricate it so it moves down from the mouth through the pharynx into the esophagus and down along the esophagus more easily. It is also the site where carbohydrate digestion starts through the enzyme amylase. Excuse me. Excuse me. And again, the bolus is the clump of food that you swallow. That saliva is also going to be important because it helps reduce the amount of bacteria that is in your mouth. Most digestion occurs in the small intestine. Let me repeat that. Most digestion is going to happen in the small intestine. And in fact, virtually all digestion happens in the small intestine. The mouth is really just there to take big particles and break them down into smaller particles through mastication. And again, that's the fancy word for digestion. Limited digestion occurs in the mouth. Carbohydrate digestion starts there, and a little lipid digestion starts there, but the food is not in the mouth long enough for anything to really happen in terms of digestion. I show this lovely picture. Doesn't that look nice? Wouldn't that be a nice place to be for a few days, especially when we're having potentially not great weather in the Ithaca area? I show you this because you produce 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva every single day, which means that you can fill a swimming pool with saliva during the course of your lifetime. Fun fact. The food leaves the mouth and is swallowed and moves into the pharynx. Fancy word for throat. The pharynx is actually a shared part of the GI tract. It is also used for breathing, so it's part of the respiratory tract also. So it's going to connect the nasal cavity and passage to the trachea. It is part of the digestive system because it moves food from the mouth down to the esophagus. You're going to have this little flap of connective tissue that will flip over the trachea when you swallow, and that's known as the epiglottis. Once the food leaves the pharynx, it moves down into the esophagus, which is basically just a conduit from the pharynx down to the stomach. Now, as we go through the digestive system, I want you to remember 2 major themes. One theme is mucus, 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 because in every part of the GI tract, you will be adding mucus to the material that is moving through it in order to provide lubrication. Yes, there is mucus in your saliva. You will add mucus to the food in the esophagus. You will add mucus to your food, which is now known as chyme, once it's in the stomach, in order to help move it from the stomach into the small intestine. Mucus will also play another role in the stomach, which is to protect the stomach from the highly acidic environment that is there. You will add mucus to the food in the small intestine, again, to aid lubrication and help the material move, that chyme move more efficiently. And no surprise, you're going to add mucus to the fecal matter as you start to produce it in the large intestine, again, in order to protect the walls of the large intestine and help move the material along that organ. The other theme that you will see throughout the digestive system is these various ways that we either increase the surface area of the food that you've eaten in order to make it more easily digestible, and or changes or adaptations or specializations that occur along the GI tract, which will allow for increased volumes of food to move through it, or to provide more surface area for increased absorption. So think surface area, think increased surface area of both food and the GI tract, all to aid digestion. So we talked a little bit about the movement of the GI tract, and the big fancy word for that is peristalsis. You're going to have these involuntary muscle cells, which are known as smooth muscle cells, along the entire GI tract, in the walls of the entire GI tract. And peristalsis is the smooth and rhythmic movement of that smooth muscle in order to move food along its length. Passage between organs will be controlled by these little rings of smooth muscle, which are known as sphincters. So there will be one in between the pharynx and the esophagus. There will be another between the stomach and the esophagus. There will be another between the stomach and the small intestine. And there will be another, what a surprise, between the small and large intestine. And you can tell what's what, at least in part from those first two names. The pyloric sphincter is the one, that little ring of smooth muscle that you're going to find in between the stomach and the small intestine. And the ileocecal valve is in between the large and small intestines. Lower esophageal sphincter is also known as the gastroesophageal sphincter. Tells you exactly where it is, in between the stomach and the esophagus. This is the sphincter that may be problematic when you have so-called heartburn, which is also known as gastroesophageal reflux disorder. So this shows you what's happening with peristalsis. Food's going to move one way. You hope. If it's coming up the wrong way, then you're vomiting. And watch these two videos. I'm not going to take the time to show these to you because they show you what peristalsis looks. There you go. Hello. And there is in the gastric antrum, which is part of the stomach. This shows you a cross-section of the skull, which shows the mouth, pharynx, and the esophagus relative to the nasal cavity. We talked about the lower esophageal sphincter, which is going to be important because it prevents the material that's in the stomach, those stomach contents, from moving back up into the esophagus. And I mentioned this, so-called acid reflux or heartburn is basically material that is really acidic. It's acidified in the stomach, moving back up into the esophagus. This can be problematic if it is chronic, because you can end up with esophagitis and or other unpleasant things, which include esophageal cancer. So if you have heartburn, if you have acid reflux or GERD, please get it checked out. The other thing that you need to be aware of is this, and I'm not saying rush to your ER because you're having a heart attack. However, particularly in women, if you have GERD, a feeling of GERD, a feeling of heartburn, you may be having a heart attack or heart problem. So make sure you get checked out by a cardiologist. Now, the stomach, I've already told you the main function. The main function of the stomach is to act as a temporary holding tank for food. That's it. Very little digestion goes on there. Some, but not a lot. Contents are going to be super, super, super acidic. You have cells in the walls of the stomach that are going to produce hydrochloric acid, which makes the pH drop down to 1 or 2. The reason that we want the stomach contents to be so acidic is not to help with digestion. It is to kill bacteria that you eat or consume every time you eat and drink. Yes, indeed, every time you eat and drink, you're eating pathogens. And the acidity is going to help kill those pathogens because you're going to do what is known as denaturing protein. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the macromolecule section. Denaturing protein means that you change the structure of the protein. And if you change the structure of a protein, You are changing its function. Super important. Let me repeat that. Acid will denature a protein. And that's just a fancy way for saying breaking down the structure of a protein. When you change the structure of a protein, you change its function. So if you change the structure of a bacterial wall or the wall of a pathogen, you've changed its function and hopefully rendered it harmless. There are a few digestive enzymes that are released from the stomach walls, including a couple of enzymes that will help with protein digestion. The acidity of the stomach is going to be important because it activates calcium. And you need calcium to be activated by acid in order that you can digest it correctly. So if you're looking at antacids, which say we contain calcium, because there are some brands out there that say they are going to contain calcium, when you're talking about antacids, make sure you are taking an antacid that has the appropriate type of calcium that you can actually digest without additional activation through hydrochloric acid. What does an antacid do? It limits the acidity in your stomach. We already talked about the fact that there's mucus in the stomach. There's mucus in every single organ structure along the GI tract. So here you have it. There's our stomach. You can see the esophagus leading to it, and then you can see the small intestine. They call it small bowel in this picture. It's really the small intestine leading away from that. And you can also see the stomach's location relative to the liver and the pancreas, which we will discuss in a later session.